Welcome to another edition of No Child Left Behind Report. We're at the Northern Illinois University in Naperville, where Learning Point Associates, a major educational research firm, is housed. We're going to interview Paul Kimmelman, one of the senior research associates. Stay tuned.
Paul Kimmelman, and I'm Senior Advisor at Learning Point Associates in the Office of the CEO. Well, I was a superintendent in Ohio in more of a middle-sized urban district, and then came to Illinois as a superintendent in a very different school district. So I've had the opportunity to serve in two very different environments in school districts. In Ohio, it was more urban. It was predominantly a state-funded school district, 77% for example, which is a very high state funding percentage compared to when I came to Illinois, and the school district was 3% state-funded. I dealt with a good deal of poverty and minority students in Ohio, a district that was under a federal desegregation order, which was my primary goal to, when I went there in 3 years, get out from under the Justice Department order, which we did, which probably was what I thought my most significant accomplishment in Lima. And then coming to Illinois to an elementary school district that was in a very affluent community and totally different set of circumstances. You know, I think, you know, I went back recently and looked at some of my early interviews when I was a superintendent, and when I first became superintendent in Lima, my first superintendency, which was a very unusual move. Here was a young 40-year-old assistant superintendent in a suburban school district, leaving to go to a much larger school district, more urban issues, and taking over the incredible challenges of that kind of a school district. And as I look back at the first interview, it was like an hour interview on TV, my first week on the job, and what was I going to do. And I think my philosophy or thinking about education has been fairly consistent throughout. I've always been an advocate for accountability. I like some innovation on a consistent basis in a school district. I think that sort of aligns with the idea of always doing some R&D in your own district so that you are exploring new horizons, putting an emphasis on the students and ensuring that they're doing well, focusing on teacher growth, professional development for teachers, incorporating technology in reasonable ways so that it enhances what's being done, building administrative teams. You know, I wouldn't say that I was overly successful as a superintendent. Much of what I did was probably ahead of the curve, and not many districts might, or participants in the district staff might not have been entirely ready for some of the ideas at the time. But you know, you do your best and you try to serve their communities and as effectively as you can. Well, I spent 30, I don't remember the exact number of years, 31, 32 years in K-12 education. I started when I was 21, and by the time I was 26, I was an administrator. And you know, over half of my career was devoted to being superintendent or assistant superintendent. And as I reached the end of my career, I think I wanted to try something new, something different. That doing the same administrative task day in and day out was just sort of growing tiring to me, and I was losing my enthusiasm for my work. So the opportunity to come to an organization like Learning Point Associates that enabled me to branch out more into policy and research and education and try to learn an entirely new and different career a little bit later in life was a good opportunity for me, and it fit what my goals were for me personally. So for me, it was a very good move. I'm not sure that that would work for everyone, but this is a great organization to work for, and you're constantly being challenged. So it's not like I left stress. In some respects, I gained stress in this organization. Some of the things that we did in Illinois that I'd come for, last week, for example, I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce meeting, and there was a representative from IBM, and we sort of looked back to the days of when I was in Ohio at Lima and when I came here, and the work that we had done with IBM at the time. In Lima at the time, IBM many years ago had come out with cutting-edge programs, Writing to Read, which was John Henry Martin, which was a computer-based literacy program for young children, and a program called PALS, Principle of Alphabet Literacy, which was for adults who had problems with literacy, and it was computer-driven. It was on, at that time, they weren't called DVDs, but they were like, they weren't CDs, I forget what they were called, but large media that could store an incredible amount of information. So we provided evening labs for those adults to come into the schools to try to privately enhance their literacy skills. And then when I came to Illinois and continued working with IBM, we got involved in research and development, which was the WorldScan project. And it was the first integration of CD, videotape, and computers. I remember all the things. IBM was sending officials to our school district. Our board was very good about investing in that project, and our teachers had the opportunity of working with the people who were actually in the labs at IBM creating all these things we take for granted today, which was very interesting. We also formed a consortium of school districts that were the first ever to take the third international mathematics and science study at the time called TIMSS. No one had ever taken an international assessment as a local school district before. And we were very fortunate that at the time Secretary Riley thought this was a pretty good idea. It aligned with the national goal of being first in the world in mathematics and science, and he dedicated himself and his staff to working with us in the first year. And we ultimately were able to take it, not free by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we had to come up with over $100,000 to take it. And going, our 20 school districts going to our boards of education, at the time and saying, look, we want to spend this money for a test that's never been taken by anyone at the local level before to get results that we're not sure will be in what form or what they will tell us, but we think it's a good idea nonetheless. And the board supported us, and we did it, and President Clinton came. We learned a lot about it, and it certainly was a project that was a forerunner to NCLB. Well, obviously, I felt strongly about it. I co-authored a book with one of my colleagues from the First in the World Consortium, Achieving World-Class Schools, which we had learned a great deal from Dick Haynes and Don Chalker, who had been doing really all of the world-class research in the United States. And I think they were at Western Carolina University and had written 3 books on the topic. And it was evident that there was a change taking place in education, and it was like difficult for local practitioners to see what was coming over the horizon. And look how long it has taken from the 3 business summits to really get the message to where Friedman's world is flat concept now has finally struck the chord that's getting so much attention in not only schools but businesses and hospitals and any enterprise around the country. But you know, our thoughts were that world-class standards were extremely important, that we were no longer school districts that just competed against each other in the Illinois testing, and despite the fact that anyone said, you know, we really don't compete, the first thing that any superintendent ever did when the Illinois test results were released was write down their scores and compare them to their neighboring district's scores. But it became less relevant because all of these districts were good districts. They were doing a good job. But if there were a couple of things that we truly learned from the First in the World experience that I think were a prelude to NCLB, it was one, internationally, our schools could compete. If you would have asked me when we took the TIMSS the first time, would our 20 school districts treated as a country be competitive with certainly at that time the highest achieving Asian schools, you know, I would have said we might do okay, but we're not going to be at the top. And we were somewhat surprised that we were. We were at the top in basically everything, with the exception of 4th and 8th grade, where Singapore alone was at the top. So the Japans, the Koreas, and other higher achieving countries were really linked together with us, and we were right there statistically with them as performers. So we understood at that point in time that there was an importance in being able to compete internationally, at least to determine how your students would do internationally, with a comparison at the grade levels. The second thing we learned was that not all of our students did very well. So that even though we were high achieving schools and we had large percentages of students who exceeded the proficiencies on the nationally normed tests that we used and the state criteria reference tests, there were still subgroups of students. We didn't identify them the way they were identified necessarily under NCLB, but there were subgroups of students that didn't do well. And by looking at that kind of research data, we were able to make some reasoned determinations as to what needed to be changed in our own school districts. Well, I was at a meeting last week, and I think that it affirmed what I believed would be my answer to this question. No Child Left Behind has changed the national conversation about education in this country in ways that it didn't change over the 50 or so preceding years. When I first started implementing NCLB, I took a historical look at all the reform initiatives that had taken place. And even the Glenn Commission that I served on, which was chaired by an icon of America. I mean, John Glenn, if you take away the political side, being a senator from Ohio, he was an astronaut who was an icon to this country. It was a bipartisan commission for mathematics and science teaching for the 21st century, and completed its report and had prestigious people on the commission, and it ended up gathering dust. It didn't promote major policy change in the United States, which no reform initiative in math and science has done a whole lot over that period of time. And No Child Left Behind, because it included serious sanctions for school districts, certainly has grabbed the attention of people. And so the conversation now is more about getting better research to make more informed decisions for effective program implementation. It talks about the quality of teachers in ways that's never been discussed before, and it really illuminated the fact that students who tend to be in very remote rural communities or in some urban schools tend to get teachers who don't have the background to teach the courses they're teaching and also have less experience. And there's evidence that those students have a greater need for more qualified teachers, and that the effective teachers over time make a big difference in the success of students. The second part is it brought a focus to the students who aren't doing well in this country and the incredible dropout rate in the number of students who aren't completing high school. And when you start engaging in that discussion, and there are the camps, as we all know in education. There are the pro camps, the con camps. But nonetheless, the discussion's out there, and as we head toward reauthorization, it would be my hope that all this evidence now that we're getting from the law, which we've never had before, will help lead to improving it. Well, first I would say Gerald Bracy is a brilliant writer and researcher, and he can make compelling arguments for his position. I don't agree with him in total, so my argument would be that everybody can spin their arguments. The anecdote that I would give you to this question is that when I was in college, one of the books we used in a statistics class was How to Lie with Statistics. It's a little paperback book, and the incredible thing is that when I was teaching a research class not too many years ago, How to Lie with Statistics is still a common book that's used 30, 40 years later. So it tells you that people spin arguments in their own ways, and that's fine for the people who want to win or lose. For me, the argument is that today there are a number of countries that are producing an educated populace that traditionally weren't there before. You think about Negroponte's $100 laptop experiment and how young children in Nigeria can now log on to the internet and get the same information that children in more affluent suburbs or communities around the United States can get. My argument would be that it's going to be very important for us to be able to produce an innovative, knowledgeable student who's able to think critically, solve problems, work collaboratively, understand the core subjects that are emphasized in No Child Left Behind. Or Gerald Bracy's argument is going to be moot because we won't have the educated citizenry that's going to continue to enable us to be a competitive nation. He makes sense, and we need the Gerald Bracys at the table just as we need the opposite viewpoints at the table. We need the more extremes of the argument so that many of us who like to sort of ride more toward the middle can take advantage of their wisdom and try to build a better plan. Well, my research, which would be nothing more than what we found from the First in the World Consortium, because that is where the research was. Our research clearly found that those students in our school districts, and admittedly, so that the caveat is on the table right away, for the most part, the school districts in the First in the World Consortium were more affluent school districts. They were majority Caucasian school districts. There were pockets of minority students who would be categorized in the subgroups and disadvantaged, but not in extremely large numbers. But the one thing that clearly came out, probably best with our high school results, which led to some internal strife within the consortium, was the fact that those students in this country who are the top achievers are every bit as good as the top achievers around the world. You take the best of our 12th grade students, the AP students in the consortium, the high schools that participated in the First in the World Consortium, who were competing against the best in the world in the other countries, were clearly among the best, if not the best. Our AP students were tops. When you understand that the United States didn't have enough numbers in some of the eligibility groups, for example, for like standard physics or calculus tests or something like that, we had to reach below what would traditionally have been the eligible students and take students who didn't fall in those categories. And the First in the World Consortium students fell below the international average. And our high school people were upset about that because it wasn't apples and oranges comparison, because the other countries had really students who were qualified to take those types of exams, but we weren't, so we scored lower. The fact is that our best, competing with their best, were the best, and our 4th and 8th grade students competed quite favorably. We didn't reach the level of Singapore, but it's not just a horse race either. And the cultures of these countries are very different. And so you have to take that into account. We offered comprehensive programs for our students. Our parents were well involved in our school districts. When our teachers taught, they would meet the standards of highly qualified teachers in NCLB. For the most part, teachers who taught 8th grade algebra in consortium schools were teachers who had no less than a minor, and in most instances a major in math before they were teaching algebra. So, my take on it is that if we take the issues that you raise in the Bracy arguments, we no longer have jobs available for the traditional student that graduated high school when I graduated many years ago. Those students could walk out the door of their high school with less of an education and go into a very good manufacturer and get a good factory job, support their families, get their children into college, and do well. Those jobs aren't available anymore. So what we need to do is focus on where our weakest links are in much the same way that we do with our sporting teams. When teams don't win the World Series or the Super Bowl or the NBA championship, they go out and they look for the parts that will make their teams more competitive, so hopefully they can win. We need to take our weakest links in our education system and improve them. And if we can do that, we will remain a productive society. I think you're throwing two questions at me in one question, so well,
get back to, the subgroups. What is the strength of the subgroups? Looking closely at this.
Well, and I'll answer both questions because I think the two questions are the fair question. The first question, should there be subgroups? Yes. The fact is that school districts were able to say we are doing very well when in fact there were students year in and year out who weren't doing very well in those districts, but they were lost because the percentage of students that was doing well was very high. And so if you even in the school district where I was a superintendent, if we had 80+% of our students exceeding the state proficiency standards or at least meeting them, people are very happy. But what happens to that 20 or lower percentage of students who traditionally year in and year out weren't meeting it? So the need to identify the subgroups and illuminate their performance just makes you more accountable for how you are doing. That being said, the fact that the law says 100% of the students by the year 2014 are going to meet state proficiency is an onerous task, and one that is highly unlikely, and that if you went to 2019, every school in the country could likely be suffering the most severe sanctions of NCLB, and that is not, I don't think, the intent of the law. We need to find a better system of addressing the sanctions and what schools are really the intended recipients of the most serious sanctions of the law, while holding all schools' fingers to the fire for focusing on the needs of all students and making sure that they're accountable to the parents and that the students are making improvements, or allowing those parents opportunities to make choices about where they want their children to go to school. That is one of those real deal breakers in Congress as well. And I'm not advocating vouchers, but I think the opportunity for students to move around in their public school systems or to have some choices if schools consistently are failing will, from my perspective, it will help those schools that sometimes lose students, because it will enable them to focus on other areas as opposed to dealing with parents who tend to become more an adversary of the school. By giving them an opportunity to perhaps take their children and place them in other schools that are more willing to accept them, might bring more stability in the system. I can't assure anybody of that, but I do think that it's important to be accountable and identify your strengths and your weaknesses. I think I would like to be one of the lone voices sometimes, or the lonely voices, and suggest that I think Secretary Page had a very daunting challenge, being the first Secretary of Education handed NCLB from Congress and the White House and told to implement it. That would be my defense. I don't think the department was as effective implementing the law as it could have been. It sort of closed the door on many in the education establishment who could have been there to help him with implementation. So I don't think that he probably was given a great deal of latitude to be real flexible, but through the implementation process and pulling in people who had been in education for a long time and understood the field could have been helpful, and they weren't welcome at the door. Secretary Spellings came from the White House, was certainly a real player in the writing of NCLB, and saw what had occurred over a number of years, and came in and began to offer more flexibility so that some of the problems with the law could be addressed. It was probably a very sensible switch. I mean, it didn't make a lot of sense to say, well, your first choice is to go to another school before your school had the option of providing you the services, whether they be through the school or be through a private provider, to see if you could remediate some of the issues that would lead to them leaving. So, and I think that Secretary Spellings is very knowledgeable about this law, very knowledgeable about the issues, and particularly about policy. And she has been flexible. And I guess the supreme compliment for the Secretary is that Congressman Miller has been very complimentary of her performance as Secretary, which certainly speaks volumes because he comes from the other party and would be inclined to be a critic. And he's very passionate about this law. And so I think Secretary Spellings has attempted to provide some flexibility while walking on what would be very thin ice, pleasing Congress and pleasing the field. Well, I'm not a psychometrician, so I don't want to wander into the technical analysis, statistical analysis, but I think what's being implied, and importantly, and will be a strength in the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, is that more might be considered, more variations of what can be used to determine whether a school is actually making what will be construed as adequate yearly progress. I think people have to appreciate the congressional staff that put this law together probably did an excellent job. I mean, this was a huge law, 1,100 pages, and no federal law I think is created that is perfect on its first run. In fact, we're still looking at Medicare and Social Security and making revisions to the law. So, adequate yearly progress is probably the number one provision of the law that needs change. And so those who are talking about growth models and value-added models and informative assessment models are bringing new ideas to the table. Had that discussion even been thought about when NCLB was first written, it would probably have never been given any serious attention, first by the field that would have said no way, and probably from those who were writing the law that it was going to get too complex. Denzel McGuire, who worked for Senator Gregg, said in a public meeting, and so I'm paraphrasing, but certainly it was a public comment, they really didn't have an idea how complicated this was ultimately going to become once it was rolled out. So I think that the beauty of the law and the wisdom that has emerged from it is that there are those both in the field, the practitioners, and the researchers who are coming forward now and saying, there's a better way to do this. And there are more ways than just one. And I think that that will be a great strength if Congress pays attention when this law is being reauthorized and provides more of a menu of assessments to allow states and schools to comply. Well, that's a really great question. I don't know whether states and practitioners would be more supportive of the law. The fact is that it is really a misunderstood law. I've been speaking on No Child Left Behind. One of the assignments I had from this organization was to go out and talk on the law. So I rarely had friendly audiences, because I've always said at the beginning of my talks that I think this is a great law, and I think this country needed this law to move education forward. That being said, most people don't understand this is, for the most part, a state-driven law, so that those who complain about the law the most have to understand that there are no national standards. The law requires states to write their own standards. If you don't make them rigorous enough, you might be uncovered through the National Assessment of Education Progress testing, NAEP testing, so that if you say 90% of our students in the state in the 4th grade are doing really great work in math, and then they take NAEP and 80% of the students in the state don't meet proficiency, there's a question that can arise from it. The teacher quality, the assessment, the testing is all the responsibility of the state. The highly qualified teacher provisions, other than the 3 core requirements, are all established by the state. Much of this law is state-driven. The state has the latitude to write the provisions, so long as they comply with the fundamental principles. But all that being said, federal funding is not a major portion of most state budgets. But like everything else, it's enough that you need it, so you need to comply. And so I think during the reauthorization, one thing that's very different now, despite the fact that the law is intended to be reauthorized in 2007, everybody has lined up. They all have their reports, their committees, their commissions, their hearings. Everybody is there at the table now, trying to make their feelings heard, as opposed to what had happened prior to the first NCLB. So I think that we're going to have an incredibly good national discussion about this law. My sense is Congress is going to be somewhat unwavering on certain basic principles, but will be open to hearing what are the legitimate concerns of states and school districts, and how can we make this law work better, because it's not to anyone's advantage for the states and the school districts to be constantly opposing the provisions of the law, or for Congress to be saying we're not going to change the law. There has to be some meeting of the minds on how to make this a good law.